outlaw bookseller, the usual thing or the unusual thing, slightly burnt out, ready to take a holiday, off to Hay on Wye next week. What are we doing today? Well, at the moment, I have the Anthologies bug, as you've probably noticed. Also, I'm in a very new wave mood, not an unusual thing for me. So I thought we'd look at some new wave anthologies. Now, this is not an anthology. There will be a new wave top 10 UK coming up, and there'll be a new wave top 10 USA coming up. And the two will intersect in the manner that these things did at that time. This is J.G. Ballard's The Atrocity Exhibition, his collection of condensed novels. Is it a novel in itself? Well, the jury is out. This is the Research Classics hardcover limited edition, which dates from the early 90s. 400 copies, signed by JGB, with additional annotations, illustrations, what have you. And I decided to pop this here because the format of this, and it's illustrated sort of nature, I better not show you that one because that gets banned from YouTube, is sort of very much indicative of what New Worlds is like. In its classic New Wave period in the late 1960s, New Worlds magazine, edited by Michael Moorcock from about, I think, 64, previously by E.J. Ted Carnell, Edward John Carnell, who then moved on from New Worlds after curating it for a very, very long time. It started in Britain before World War II when it was called Nova Terrae. And Carnell then moved off and did new writings in SF, and Moorcock took on New Worlds for Robertson Vintner, compact books. And it was then in this format. The bibliography and genealogy of New Worlds as a magazine is incredibly complicated. I'm not going to go into it here, but suffice to say that inasmuch as if New Wave was a thing, then it was very, very much New Worlds magazine that codified it or decodified it and opened it up for the whole world. This is SF Impulse, which was also published by Robertson Vintner compact books, who took on New Worlds at that time. And he went through various different formats, but the most famous format is the sort of large format magazine. Now, I don't have any of them because I don't collect magazines. I decided not to go down that rabbit hole. And I basically read the stories in anthologies, collections, and what have you, and I've read a lot of them over the years. Maybe one day, who can say? But I thought we'd have a look at some important New Wave anthologies, because if you want to understand New Wave SF, particularly in Britain, and Britain is really where New Wave was the most important thing, and it was the truest and purest sort of New Wave, you have to understand short stories. So we're going to look at that today. And some of these I was originally going to include in my top 10 UK New Wave, which, as I say, will come at another time, a bit later on this year. So really, where do we begin? Well, I mentioned Impulse. I wanted to mention Impulse because Impulse was a magazine. It was usually called Science Fantasy. And Impulse also published a lot of good New Wave material as well. So if you ever see any copies of it, it's quite uncommon now. People are charging silly money for it. Do pick them up. So there's an example of what it looked like. But New Worlds, in its most famous format, was rather like this edition of the Atrocity Exhibition. Now, the Atrocity Exhibition, just as an aside for that, as we have it here, sort of holding pride of place, was published in the US under the title Love and Napalm Export USA by Nelson Doubleday, I believe. And I think the chief guy of Doubleday was wandering around their own press one day. He picked the book up as it was coming off the press. And when he noticed that there was a piece in there called Why I Want to, four-letter word, Ronald Reagan, he decided to have the lot pulped, and very few got out. It's very, very uncommon. There was one on AB a while ago, and it was 800 quid. Would I love one? Yes, I would, very much so. It's one of the sort of few ballads that I don't have a UK first of. It's the very early ones I don't have UK first of. But this signed limited expanded edition has always done the job for me, so there we go. So this gives you an idea of the area we're in. What is New Wave science fiction, or what was it, we should say? Well, New Wave science fiction was, the term was coined by Christopher Priest. If you watch the Christopher Priest interview on the channel, where I ask him about that, because he's been cited as the first person to use that term in relation to SF. he used it in a small fanzine. It was then later used by people like Judith Merril and what have you. And what Chris said at the time was that the new SF that was emerging then in the early 60s was going to be revolutionary in the way that French and generally European cinema was becoming then, with new techniques involving subjectivity, improvisation, messing with the fabric of time, and generally trying to create a new language for cinema. And this is what was happening with SF as well. Certain writers had become dissatisfied with the way that science fiction was sticking to the same tired old tropes. We'd seen quite a bit of change in the 1950s with the sort of writers who worked for magazines like Galaxy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, doing all sorts of social satire and what have you, and creating great work. Colin Kornbluth, Kurt Vonnegut, Robert Sheckley, those sort of people. And, you know, that was a good step forward from the Golden Age, which was got pretty tired, but it was still looking at the same old tropes. And J.G. Ballard famously said Earth is the only alien planet, and that SF needed to turn its back on the escapist adventurous space travel and that sort of thing, and look at the way that the media landscape and how change in our time on planet Earth was affecting human consciousness. Somebody he was inspired by, and somebody who was a figurehead who inspired most of, or if not all of the key New Wave writers, was William S. Burroughs, the American Beat Generation novelist and thinker. And we'll talk about Burroughs again, but Burroughs' influence, where he used modernist literary techniques, stream of consciousness, what he called the cut up and fold in method, where you take two different texts and merge them together and create new sentences, including bits from science fiction novels like Henry Kuttner's Fury in his novels, really was a game changer. And really, for everybody who thought that modernism had wrung the sort of language dry after James Joyce's work, that you could do no more with language, it was clear to people like Moorcock and Ballard and Priest and others that by meshing the raw energy of popular forms like SF with the avant-garde literary experimentation of modernism, that was a way forward, and that way that SF would reflect the massive and rapid social and technological change that was happening in the 1960s, and, you know, in the decade before as well, the post-war economic boom in the USA, and in Britain the white heat of technology, and we'd never had it so good, and the social change that came out of things like the pill. So new wave writing was part of the counterculture, particularly in the UK. And that was the time when SF was at its coolest, at its hippest, and at its point where it intersected with emerging youth subcultures. So it was about things like the media, fast cars, it was about sex, it was about time, it was about memory, identity, it was about social change, political change, revolution. And if you look at any social history of the 1960s or any history of the 1960s in the West, you see that these were times when things were sort of changing and people's consciousness was moving forward, and technology was moving at a fast pace, the space race was on, and all sorts of things were going on. So New Wave really tried to engage with that. And in 1970, I think the first issue of New Worlds from 1970, I think it had an article that said, never mind 1970, we're about 1980, and that's exactly the way SF should be. But at the same time, of course, reflecting what was going on around it. Because it was a magazine, it did publish novels, it published them in serials, but most of the work was short fiction, and short fiction was ideal for experimentation. So just to have a look at a few things today. It had precursors, of course. Probably, I'm just going to try and pick them one at a time. So today we're not really talking about this new wave, the Harlan Ellison taboo breaking US new wave, because there are some writers in this who, to my way of thinking, aren't new wave at all. Lester Del Rey prominent is amongst them, but there's lots of others like Ballard who are people like Silverberg who are finding the new experimentalism a way of doing what they wanted to do in SF after some frustration. So we're not talking about that today, we're talking about the UK. So if you're looking out for New Wave anthologies, top of your list really should be this book, New Worlds, an anthology edited by Michael Moorcock. This is a Flamingo B format paperback from the early 80s. The cover is by Juan Miro, the Spanish surrealist artist, who's just as important as people like Dali and Max Ernst and what have you. And this was published in 1983, and it was a paperback original. And this has got a great introduction that tells you, in Moorcock's own words, the sort of brief history of New Worlds in his time. If you get one, please note that this is an erratum slip that was included because the contents pagination is wrong. So it tells you, for example, that the four colour problem by Barrington Bailey is on page 42, when it's actually on, let's have a look. Well, that bit is correct. It's from pages 73 onwards, things drift. So if this is not in your copy is not complete, and you will get a bit frustrated with the contents as it's not strictly accurate, because this was never reprinted, I don't think. And of course, because it was published in Flamingo, there's the yellow spine. Flamingo was the B format literary imprint of Fontana, part of HarperCollins, or Collins as they were then. This often didn't, people would shove it in bookshops, and if they didn't know their SF, it would end up with general fiction anthologies, but it was SF, and I used to sell it back in those days. And it's really important, and it contains a lot of stories which were in New Worlds. Some of the ones which were most important in terms of award-winning and what have you. Harlan Elson's A Boy and His Dog. There was a Delaney story. I think it was Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones, was a Nebula winner. Behold the Man, the short version by Moorcock. These are not in here because Moorcock said, they're almost always available in other anthologies. You have to remember this is the early 80s. And New Worlds had folded several times and been rebooted. And he does say at the beginning of the introduction, I don't think it's safe to say that New Worlds is dead. So, and it's come back several times. So this is one to really look out for. And this contains work by people like Moorcock himself, J.G. Ballard, M. John Harrison, Thomas M. Dish, John T. Sladek. Dish and Sladek, of course, American writers who moved to the UK to be part of New Worlds. David I. Masson, who Christopher Priest mentioned in the interview we did. Charles Platt, Norman Spinrad, another American. And various others. There is criticism in here by John Clute and M. John Harrison. So there's all sorts of stuff, and there's lots of obscure names in here, people you won't know so much. Langdon Jones, the Welsh SF writer. Pamela Zoline, important early feminist SF writer. There's people like Joel Zoss, Harvey Jacobs. There's Giles Gordon, the publisher. Christopher Finch. And, these are people whose work you won't often see. And it's very experimental. A lot of it is non-linear, so you don't get conventional storytelling. And I think Moorcock basically picked his favourites. So it's unusual stuff. But there's some really classic things in here, like The Four Colour Problem by Barrington Bailey, Running Down by M. John Harrison, which is a story about entropy. And that's really important because entropy is at the heart of the New Wave universe. The heat death of the universe, as Pamela Zoline's story says, which is about a day in the life of an ordinary housewife viewed through the lens of entropy, the science fiction concept. And it's about how ordered systems tend towards chaos in the physical universe. That's the second or third law of thermodynamics. I can never remember which. So this is really important. So time and things breaking apart and fracturing is really important, this. And that's the thing with New Wave. It's not about providing easy answers. It's about trying to sort of help you program your consciousness to deal with the chaos of the post-war world and the modern world as it was before we moved into the even more chaotic postmodern world, which started in the late 80s. So that's a really important book to pick up. So try and get that if you can. I don't know how hard it is to get or not, but it's really, really important. So as you can tell by my tone and what I'm saying, this is not for you if you just want to read escapist space opera. There's nothing to do with that stuff at all. There are connections, like, for example, Alfred Bester, particularly Tiger and the short stories, were huge influences upon Moorcock et al. Because of some of the experimental techniques that Bester used, like concrete poetry and things like that. But, this is about true cognitive dissonance. This is about the bucket of water in the face, as I always say. This is about doing something different. It's not about being cozy and getting off on some sort of Star Wars trip. It's a totally different thing. It's literary SF. It's not for lightweights. But, if you want to challenge yourself and you want to discover better writing, having a new wave period, if you're a younger reader of SF, is really, really important. So this is stuff to get into. So you might want to try the American stuff first, but we'll come on to that in 2 or 3 videos' time. Another important anthology to get, which is relatively common, if you want them, there are several copies at Zardoz. All you need is books. I've done several videos when I visited there. And this is The New SF, edited by Langdon Jones, the Welsh SF writer and musicologist, who died a couple of years ago. And this is a really important anthology. I first bought my copy of this in Cardiff way back in the 80s, and this is a newer one I upgraded. And this has really important stuff in it. Again, it has names who are familiar from New Worlds: Giles Gordon, Michael Moorcock, James Sallis, who later became a very noted noir fiction writer. He wrote the book Drive, which was made into the film with Ryan Gosling. You'll have seen it, a fantastic film with great music by Cliff Martinez. Really amazing noir film. Came out about 10 years ago. And Sallis was only ever published as an SF writer in New Worlds. Nobody else would publish him. And he's got a great story in here called The Anxiety in the Eyes of the Cricket, which is great. And again, there's non-fiction stuff in this. Michael Butterworth's Post-Atomic is fantastic. There's a science fiction story for Joni Mitchell by Maxim Jakubowski. So you can see it's very much of the time. It's very, very 1960s. But it's really great stuff. D.M. Thomas's poetry is in here. There was a lot of poetry in New Worlds as well. It was a really interdisciplinary magazine. And this spread over into anthologies like the New SF. And you'll notice how sparse and spare it is. There's no spaceship on the cover. And when was this first published? Let's have a look. This one dates to the very end of the 60s. Let's see. New SF was published in Hutchinson hardcover in 1969. I've never seen a hardcover. It's very uncommon. This paperback edition dates from 1970. So that shows you it's modernism, it's stark, it's white. It's not messing around with any of the traditional genre imagery. While we're on that subject, actually, I wanted to thank Peter, one of the channel subscribers, who very, very kindly bought me this beautiful little anthology I'm going to show you now, which also dates from 1970. And this is A Sea of Space, edited by William F. Nolan, one of the co-writers of Logan's Run. It's got a little sticker on the front that says 5 shillings. It's a Bantam book from the USA, so it was imported. And look at that. Isn't that absolutely beautiful? Really beautiful. Thanks so much, Peter. I'm really touched by that. And look at that minimal blurb on the back. And that's rather like a Klimt, isn't it, on the cover? Gustav Klimt, Expressionism. Fantastic stuff. And I'm really, really pleased with this. So I'm just sort of diverging there. And this has got some great stuff in it. Looking through it, it's got amazing content. Ray Bradbury, Chad Oliver. It's got Charles Beaumont, who used to write stuff for The Twilight Zone. William F. Nolan himself, Robert Bloch, who of course wrote Psycho. Ray Russell, great American Gothic writer. William F. Temple. Robert Sheckley, Robert F. Young, Chris Neville, Walter L. Miller Jr., a couple of other obscure names I'd not come across. So I'm really pleased with that. Thanks so much, Peter. And it's still got the yellow spray on the text block and unbroken spine. Tiny, tiny amount of lean, but nothing that gives me pain. So I'm really pleased with that. So that's a really beautiful one. But you notice the starkness on the back. So it sort of shows the influence of New Wave, though. These are mostly more traditional sort of SF writers. A few of them are literary. So there you go. So the New SF, definitely one to watch out for. So I'll just pop that in pride of place on the podium there. There we go. Fantastic stuff. So 2 important ones. Another important one is one again that Chris Priest and I talked about in part 1 of the interview. Part 2 is coming soon. This is the Space-Time Journal, edited by Judith Merril. In the USA, this was called England Swings SF. And the American edition is bigger than this. This is abridged. I don't have the American one. This is Panther. And as Chris said, Nick Austin at Panther said, we're not having that silly title. We're not having this cliche about Britain in here. We're having something different. And fundamentally, this again has some amazing stuff. Judith Merril, of course, was a female science fiction writer. She went way, way back. Important anthologist. She was married to Frederick Pohl at one point. Really sort of key stuff. And you know, this is a great one. So you can pick this up too, because some of the stuff in this, it actually crosses over with other anthologies. Like, for example, it's got Dr. Jalabius by Hilary Bailey, who edited a later version of New Worlds. And Hilary Bailey was married to Michael Moorcock for a while at one point. It's got Ballard's You and Me and the Continuum in it. It's got an amazing story. One of my favourite New Wave stories is Blast Off by Kirill Bonfiglioli from 1964. Now, Bonfiglioli didn't write a lot of SF. He did edit Impulse at one point. And it's an amazing, amazing story, which as you read it, you think is about an astronaut getting ready, preparing and being scared and stressed and concerned about going to space in a Saturn V rocket. And then you realise that it might actually be about the crucifixion, or is it? And the two things are conflated. And this was an idea which was expanded upon by a writer called Stuart Jackman in a trilogy he did, which began with a book called The Davidson Affair. And later on, Gore Vidal, and this is in the 80s, Gore Vidal, a much more famous figure, did a book called Life from Golgotha, which they sort of looked at the life of the Christ as sort of like a media event, as if it happened today. But Blast Off is very short, it's about 4 pages, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I think it is one of the finest science fiction stories I've ever read. And it almost certainly, I wouldn't be surprised if it influenced Barry Malzberg, because Barry, towards the end of the 60s, early 70s, did Beyond Apollo and its 2 thematic sequels, which were about, you know, astronauts getting spaced out, rather like Major Tom in the David Bowie song Space Oddity from 1969, which I consider part of this tiny little subgenre of New Wave SF, of astronauts who are like, they just can't cope. It's too much, the media attention, the terror of going to the new frontier. And Ballard, of course, did many of these sort of stories as well. And the Arkham House did a collection of them, which is called Memories of the Space Age, which is fantastic. And so there you go. Blast Off is a really key one in here. You also see other major figures. If I show you the back, Langdon Jones pops up again. Langdon Jones is very experimental, hard to read, but very rewarding. Tiny oeuvre and really good. Keith Roberts emerges at this point as well, a more traditional writer in terms of prose style and what have you, but somebody who helped remind us that before the term science fiction existed, Britain had a tradition amongst mainstream literary writers of SF, and there was nothing unusual about that. Chris Priest in there rather than Christopher, David I. Masson, and this is really a fantastic anthology. These 3 first anthologies cross over each other quite a lot. But there's all sorts of unusual people here. Graham Hall, Michael Hamburger, the poet, and other people. John Calder, the publisher, the avant-garde publisher who I used to know. He's got a story in here from New Worlds. And The Run by Chris Priest, his first story, one of my favourites, is in here. And wonderful things like The Idea of Entropy at May and Porth Beach by Peter Redgrove. Josephine Saxton, who is authoress of Queen of the States, an interesting book. And the Welsh SF writer Peter Tate. I mean, these are all sort of obscure figures, but you read these stories and you get a real feel for the revolutionary fervour that seized Moorcock and Ballard and Priest and these sort of people, M. John Harris and John Clute. And, you know, they sort of forged and they helped preserve SF as a literary form. They made it part of the counterculture, and they enlivened the mainstream, because mainstream authors started picking a lot of these ideas and approaches up from these guys, you know, and they became more famous and more rich mostly. But that's the way that it goes. So that's a great one. A wonderful American anthology, which again isn't too uncommon, which I have shown recently on the channel, edited by Norman Spinrad. The New Tomorrows is fantastic. I really recommend this. This is a great crossover between US and UK New Wave, and it's kind of essential and absolutely beautiful book. Really good. And of course, Spinrad wrote Bugjack Baron, which is a near-future thriller about organ farming, reality TV, interactive TV, and government corruption. And when that was published as a serial in New Worlds, it caused the famous furore where an MP got up in the Houses of Parliament and says, why are we giving money for this filth through an Arts Council grant? Because Aldous had talked to, I think it was Angus Wilson, who did a bit of SF himself, about getting an Arts Council grant for New Worlds, and they got it and it helped keep the magazine going, which is fantastic. And that caused all sorts of problem because there were a few sort of 4-letter words in it. And Norman, you know, the Norman Mailer of SF. So this is Norman's selection from the time, and this is from, let me see, 1971, and he dedicated the book to Philip Jose Farmer. So the New World, the new sort of New World's New Wave thing really ran into the mid-70s, you know, and its impact on British SF lasted well into the 80s, and it was the big revolutionary thing that shook SF up that people had to get used to until cyberpunk came along. So just looking what's in here, Moorcock, Driftglass by Samuel R. Delany, Robert Silverberg, Langdon Jones, Damon Knight, who was a noted anthologist and critic, Ellison, Pennies Off a Dead Man's Eyes, great story. John Sladek, Tom Dish, Brian Aldiss, Michael Butterworth. Farmer's The Jungle Rot Kid on the Nod, which is Tarzan as if rewritten by William S. Burroughs as opposed to Edgar Rice Burroughs. And also obscure writers. The obscure writers are interesting because often they didn't appear in anything else apart from a few New Wave anthologies and New Worlds. Let's see, there's Bob Marsden, Terry Champagne, you know, and there's people like Ed Bryant who had a bit of a career later on. So that's a really good one because that meshes the sensibility of both things. And Norman, you know, being a writer who was unafraid and, you know, wonderful, wonderful stuff, really important figure. You know, he put all these, you know, these great things together. So that's a fantastic one to get if you can. So the New Tomorrows, do get that because it's a good mesh of the slightly more traditional US New Wave SF, which tended to take the existing tropes and twist them and what have you, as opposed to the more out there British experimentalism. But of course there's exceptions to both those things, which prove the rule really. Of course, some of the new figures in New Wave also sort of managed to get deals for their own material. And this is an interesting one. This is not uncommon. This is a book from 25p I paid for this. From, let me have a look, published by Hart Davidson, hardcover 69, and this is the Panther from 71, and this is the War Book, edited by James Sallis, who, as I say, later became a top sort of crime writer, and he really is amazing. Some of the things he did with his crime writing are rather akin to New Wave writing, because he does a thing in one of his series where he breaks the fourth wall, and the writing is about writing and about the act of writing, and the way that the central character's consciousness merges with that of Sallis himself is really interesting. And, you know, he sort of brought kind of experimentalism into contemporary noir fiction, which is quite uncommon, to be honest, in crime fiction. And that comes out of his New Wave sensibility. He also sort of wrote books about blues guitarists, and he did translations of French poetry. An amazing guy, really. This is the War Book, and it's a really good anthology about war in SF. And this has trad SF in it too, so it's a really, really good thematic one. And let's just take a look through it. And it has familiar New Wave names like George Collin. It has experimental literary modernists like Donald Barthelme, who is much better known in mainstream circles. It has traditionalists like Fritz Lieber, figures who straddle sort of all sorts of things like Algis Budrys. There's a spinrad in your Mac Reynolds, who's well known for being, you know, the only sort of pure American SF author who is definitively left-wing and Marxist. There's a Sallis, there's a Frederick Brown story, a funny story. Henry Kuttner, going right back to the Golden Age, the guy who, to my way of thinking, really brought style into science fiction writing. George Macbeth, S.S. Johnson, unusual names. So this is great stuff. So that's a good mesh again. So it's a good companion to the New Tomorrows. So it shows the contribution the two of the very fine American contributors to the British New Wave really sort of had. So those are great ones to watch out for. What else do we have? Well, of course, there have been a number of selections published over the years, or rather back in the day, I should say, because it's been a long time now. There's a series called Best SF Stories from New Worlds. This is number 6. This is pretty common, this one. I've had it for forever. And it takes some of the very best stories from the Moorcock era. And the ones that I've bought, you know, there were times when I was sort of buying these things to get these stories. So some of these stories I've got in, you know, 5-6 different times. But it's got uncommon things like Bar Block Sheep, which is M. John Harrison's first story. Though I have a suspicion there's one in Impulse, which is under a different name. So I must try and ask him about that. And it's got The Ersatz Wine by Christopher Priest. There's a Carol Emshwiller story, somebody you don't hear much about. Harvey Jacobs, the Harvey Jacobs story here is wild. And, you know, you get this thing where you have to love the difficulty to enjoy New Wave. Like there's a story in here called The Luger is a 9mm automatic handgun with a parabellum action by Jerry Mundis, an obscure figure who I think worked for the Scott Meredith Literary Agency at one point when Malsberg or Spinrad were working for it in the 70s. And, you know, this is great stuff. So, you know, you have to sort of be prepared to sort of want to have your mind expanded. This is a good one too. This is volume 7. What is in here? Let's see. Cracking stuff in here. Harrison, Barrington Bailey, Ballard, Josephine Saxton, Moorcock, Delaney, Charles Platt. great stuff. So these are the names. You see these names popping up time and time again, you know, and they sort of circle around each other. And the fulcrum of swinging London, as it was laughingly called within SF, was New World, you know, and people like Delaney, Spinrad, Dish and Sladdick coming over to the UK to engage with Moorcock and Ballard and everything. Exciting stuff. And Burroughs was in London at that point as well, I think, especially late 60s, early 70s. Burroughs was living in London for quite some time. So, you know, it is a sort of a sign of the zeitgeist. So these are good ones to watch out for as well. So you've got to be prepared to do the shopping and get out there and pick up these anthologies. Now, in the 70s, New Worlds had one of its periodic relaunches as a paperback book, and these are known as New Worlds Quarterly. I think the actual, this is number 1, the actual volume number is something like New Worlds 221, but they decided to avoid confusion and make it number 1. The first 8 of these are published by Sphere and quarterly, so they were every 3 months, every 12 weeks, and they're very handsome. I got a complete set of them. And again, I was talking actually with via email with Alan, who is one of the subscribers here. And hi, Alan. And Alan and I are meeting up next week. And by the time you see this, Alan and I will have met up in Hale and White because he lives in that neck of the woods. And he's a sort of big New Worlds fan. He sort of collects the magazine. And he was saying that he felt that this period, the 70s period of New Worlds, is actually the best. And he does have a point, because at this point, some of the writers who were very young when they started had matured and were doing better work. And as much as I love M. John Harrison particularly, and he did great work before 75, once you get to the mid-70s, he really starts cooking. And Chris Priest is the same as well. You know, the early stuff's amazing, but when you get to the sort of, you know, the sort of mid-70s, they're really fantastic. And there's such incredible stuff in this. It's the quality of the writing. Dish, Red, Ballard, Harrison, Sladek, Roberts. You know, I don't really want to talk about the content because you've got to read these things for yourself, and it's quite difficult sometimes to talk about the content for New Worlds. And this is number 2, which I think is a stunning cover. These are getting harder to find now because people tend to hang on to them. But, you know, I revisit them time and time again. And you get people at the beginning of their career. There's a Rachel Pollack story in here, which must have been one of her very first. Fantastic, beautiful. And you can probably see on the podium there behind me, the other podium, the display thing, the other editions. And then volumes 9 and 10 were Corgi. And then it sort of folded. It didn't sort of happen, and there was a brief reboot in the late 70s. So those are some New Worlds, New Wave related SF anthologies for the UK, which are important to get under your belt. I just want to show you one more. This, I'm not sure if this is in print now because it was reissued in the early 90s with a new title. And this is The Nature of the Catastrophe, Hutchinson hardcover. I bought this at the Royal Con 87. I have showed it on the channel before. It cost me 30 quid, which is a heck of a lot of money then. That was half a week's wages for me then. And it's edited by Moorcock and Landon Jones. And these are stories about Jerry Cornelius. Now, Jerry Cornelius is a character that Moorcock created in a number of short pieces which were published in New Worlds because nobody else had published them, and they eventually came together as a book called The Final Programme. The Final Programme had 4 sequels. One of them won the Guardian Fiction Prize in 1977. That was The Condition of Muzak. And Jerry Cornelius is a, how can you describe him? He's sort of like the myth figure of the 20th century. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He's a rock star, a former Jesuit priest. He's an assassin. And he is an avatar of the Eternal Champion. So if you like Moorcock's fantasy stuff, you relate to him. He moves in the borders between law and chaos, and he steps from one side to another. And he's very sort of 60s. He wears a black car coat. He's got long black hair. He, I say, he loves rock music, and he has an interesting relationship with the rest of his family. It mirrors some of the events in Elric of Melniboné. He's probably the closest to Elric, but he is very much a 60s and 70s character. There's also the possibility that everything that happens to him may be just in the head of a teenager in the late 60s in Ladbroke Grove in London, Notting Hill Gate, where, you know, counterculture bands like Hawkwind came from, where Moorcock lived at the time, very countercultural area. And there are other sequels since. There's 8 or 9 books altogether, novellas, short stories. And what Moorcock did, he said that Jerry Cornelius and the characters around him and the narratives, which show a Europe and an America and a world gradually collapsing and falling into entropy and chaos. And it's all very arch. A lot of the time you have no idea what's going on. There's no info dump. The characters are talking about the chaotic situations. They're changing sides in political sort of movements and what have you, and in military actions and espionage actions. And Moorcock said that Jerry and the characters were like the template that anybody could use. So there's stories about Jerry in here by M. John Harrison, a poem by Max Jakubowski, all sorts of people, and then other people did them over the years. So the later edition is called The New Nature of the Catastrophe. It's much, much bigger. But this is the pure new wave one, and this is one of my most beloved books. And I've got this signed by about 5 of the contributors over the years. There's a spin rad in here as well. And, you know, this is really great stuff. There's a wonderful old disc called The Firmament Theorem, and that is the illustration from the cover of New Worlds, which accompanied The Firmament Theorem on its appearance there, and that's by Mal Dean, an artist who died in the mid-70s, who's very talented. And that's a great one as well. Chris Priest, I will mention Chris again, because he said he never wrote one of these because he felt they were kind of funny voice writing. When you read them, you'll understand what he means. And when he first said that to me, I thought, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but I love them nonetheless. They are a kind of funny voice writing, but they are experimental and they're very entertaining. And you can see the influence of Bester. You can see the influence of characters like Gully Foyle and Ben Reich, the Demolished Man, upon this. And that sort of freewheeling attitude. As Bester was a hip guy, you know, he was a cool guy. And it sort of translates into this. And you can also see how Jerry influenced characters in early cyberpunk fiction in the work of, say, John Shirley, Bruce Sterling, and William Gibson in the figure of Case. Massively important. So Jerry Cornelius is an important figure, connecting the sort of flash and filigree of 50s literary SF from Galaxy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, people like Bester, Sheckley, those sort of things, those sort of really fiery things, with what came in the 80s with the gleaming chrome and, you know, the burning down of the universe of consciousness and machine interface that we saw in cyberpunk. So there's a few new wave anthologies for you representing the UK. You do have to be prepared to jump in. When I do a top 10 UK new wave collections and novels, because of course collections are important as well, like Ballard, particularly Ballard short stories are probably more important than his novels. These are very much things to look at. I'll talk more about the subjects and about the plots and characters and what have you, and we'll do a bit of that when we do a US top 10 new wave as well. So this is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. This will go out at the end of January. By then I hope to have a bit more energy because I'll have had some time off, and in February we should pick up on the schedule again, which will be great. Bye for now.